And then 10 years ago, this museum opened, and CBC was here for that as well, of course. The official opening was actually February 18th of 2016, so just a few days ago. So it's great to see everyone here at the Chimczuk, and I don't know if you've gone through all of the exhibitions and our exhibition out in the hallway or not, but for sure, if not, be sure and stay afterwards, because we're going to have to be over there talking to people as well. Now, you probably know that that exhibit is all about CBC and Canada, and it's called The Evolution of Public Broadcasting in Windsor. And CBC, I'm sure anybody in here knows that it's different than other media outlets because wasn't created to be a profit-making company. And decisions about what stories to cover and what programs to present are not influenced by the need to make money. It's a public broadcaster. CBC is supported, of course, by funding from Parliament, and in large part. And the exhibit shows how CBC and Radio-Canada and Windsor have changed over the years. The technology has certainly changed. If you've been in the exhibit, you know. People came and went from here. Lots of famous names with CBC and other networks worked here at one time. Programs were created, others were canceled. Things changed. But one thing that has remained constant is the goal to create a quality product. And so the fundamentals are the same. Accuracy, balance, fairness, being principled in what you do. So today's guest speakers know that better than anyone because they're going to talk about the journalistic coverage of municipal governments, particularly Windsor City Hall. And even with lots of changes in the coverage, the aim, of course, is still the same. For people who live here to understand what goes on with municipal government. So our speakers today are Percy Hatfield, who was a municipal affairs reporter with CBC TV for many years. And then when he retired, he was on council for 2 terms, did some other job after that too. Something about going up to Toronto, you know, they all go up to Toronto. Tony Doucette did lots of interviews about the goings on at City Hall while he hosted CBC Radio's Windsor Morning. And then one of my current faves locally is Chris Ensing, video journalist. We didn't have video journalists back then. Video journalist who covers, among other things, City Hall for CBC in Windsor. And there will be some time at the end for questions. I'm going to make sure about that. Back in the old days when I used a manual typewriter, this is how we kept time with the stopwatch. But how we're going to keep time today, because these guys have to stick to their allotted time, is we're going to set the timer on here, okay? So, and I'm going to leave it right here. So when people come up, they can't miss it. All right. So when your time's up, you're going to have to turn this off. All right. So first, let's hear from Percy.
Thank you all for coming. Brett Morrison and I came early and we've been talking so much my voice is already shattered. So it's a pleasure to be with these guys. Tony and I both lived in Moncton, New Brunswick, and I lived in Newfoundland, and Chris used to work in Newfoundland and Labrador, so it's almost like old home week. I started at CBC Radio in December of '75 in Windsor and transferred over to television, I think in the summer of '78. There were 5 of us reporting at the radio station, and we would take turns on whatever your schedule was of who was going to cover City Hall. There was no municipal affairs reporter at that time. That was back when Frank Wansborough was mayor, then Bert Weeks was mayor, and Elizabeth Kishcon was mayor, and David Burr was mayor, and John Wilson was mayor, and Mike Hurst was mayor. Some guy, Eddie Francis, came along, and then Drew Dilkins. So it's been a while. I started, I think, covering City Hall in about, I was in the early 80s. We had Dick Sherman did it for the longest time, and then Ron Lindsay Ron Lindsay Brown, and then myself. And I was there a long time covering Windsor City Council. But when we all started, and a lot of the people in this room remember this well, we were shooting on film, and not tape, film, which had to be developed. And we had a film lab that we used over on Wyandotte Street West. And I think it took about an hour, Bill Baker and I were talking about maybe an hour to get some film developed. So you're always pushing deadline in those days. But City Council used to meet on Monday night, not during the day. And one of the perks of covering City Council when I was there was, or covering it, was the United Grill across from the Armories. And they used to have Monday specials. And you could get ribs and chicken at a great price and a free dessert, either coconut cream pie or banana cream pie. So by the time we got to City Council, we're ready to nod off. Not that we ever did. Well, but it was a different time, more the characters on City Council in those days were very colorful. There were even a couple of former mayors that were on council over the years. Frank Ronsborough came back as a councillor. Mike Patrick, who was there before Wannsee, came back as a councillor for a while. In those days, the councillors were called aldermen, and Donna Patterson Champagne was on council and said, let's change this to councillor. And Wannsee, being Wannsee, used to call her Alderdoll. Oh yeah, those were the days. Those were also the days when they used to smoke at City Hall, and it was a big deal when they finally closed that down. But, and in those days, there used to be, across from the Armories on the other side to the east, there was the Top Hat, very popular restaurant, bar, entertainment center. Sam, Tony Bennett, all kinds of great people sang at the Top Hat. But council would meet in camera in the afternoon and then go over to the Top Hat for dinner and sometimes drinks. And yeah, so they would have a couple of drinks, go back to council. And this one night, two of the councillors, two of the aldermen, Don Clark and Roy Belligello, started bickering at the Top Hat, get into a fist fight in the council chambers at the end of the council meeting, which was big news at the time, of course, it would be.
Good times.
And that was right.
Good times.
Good times, Dale Mulder, yes. And actually that led to Don Clark losing his council seat in the next election when Howard McCurdy ran against him. And Dr. Howard McCurdy, university prof, who went on to become a member of Parliament. So yeah, we had our challenges in those days covering these sorts of stories. It was a good time in Windsor because municipal politics is where it all begins. It's where it's the most hands-on to most ratepayers, taxpayers, homeowners, because you're going to bump into your councillor now at Caesars or a bingo hall or the liquor store, or the grocery store, at the hockey rink. Because they're here, they live in the community. Whereas once you get elected provincially and federally, you're gone off to Toronto or Ottawa most of the time. In my case, provincially, I go to Toronto on a Sunday night train and come home on a Thursday night train. I'd be in my office on Fridays and out and about in the community going to events on Saturday and Sunday. So you don't really have that grassroots, if you will, contact with everybody that, as a councillor, you have on a daily basis. Anyway, in coverage, in the old days of film, you had to get developed, and then it had to be spliced, and you would have an A reel and a B reel. And your A reel was your voice is on tape saying, George Plantis was at City Hall today and he had this to complain about. And then there would come up, George speaking. And then the B reel would be when the background of City Hall and council chambers and the announcer, the reporter's voiceover. And that voiceover was recorded on some of you may remember, an 8-track. And a big deck, twice the size of this. That would have to be inserted into a machine. And even to record in those days, I think we had 14 different unions, 21 across the entire system. It was a lot of unions, and I couldn't record my voice. I had to get a NABED technician to push the button, stop the button, push the button, stop the button. Cupie, I think, ran the film area, Barry, and we were the media, well, at that time, the Newspaper Guild or the Canadian Media Guild eventually. Which was eventually the CBC settled down into one big union, which was interesting. I mean, there was an announcer in the late show would be in QP, the technicians would be in NABET. The person, Jerry Renault, would bring you a glass of water, but the announcer was in QP. And there'd be somebody for the lighting and somebody. Now it's not like that at all, which is very good. During our tenure at CBC, of course, some of you will remember the shutdown that we went through when the CBC decided for 4 years that we could do our news stories out of Toronto and be broadcast.
Take my time. Take my time. Take your time. I said it for 8, so you know.
Oh, so I have 2 minutes. And we learned very well that Toronto wasn't interested in our stories. Bert Weeks passed away, and I was trying to convince the people in Toronto this was a big news story. And well, what I got back from the assignment desk was, well, they just won't sing in Toronto. And so their first lead story was traffic on Bay Street. And another time, we're doing these live hits from the studio parking lot, and it's just starting to look like rain. And I'm standing there, and they'd say, oh, we're going to drop you down from the first block to the second block. Okay. And then it starts to rain. And now we're going to put you in the third block. Okay. Now it's pissing down rain. The lightning is flashing all over the place. And finally they come, and it was like standing in a shower for a half an hour, trying to introduce your story. Anyway, those weren't the best of times, but then we reopened with the Windsor experiment, and our reporters became video journalists, and our camera people became reporters, and we set a tone. They gave us a 15% premium to prove it could be done. Once we proved it could be done, they cut it back to 3%. Thank you very much. But that's how the CBC evolved with all the technical stuff that they have now. And people can talk about how easy or not it is when you have to do your TV story, your radio hit, your web hit, whatever that's called, the internet something or other. Chris will tell you all about that. I'll be delighted to answer any questions later on. Our time is limited.
He's kidding.
Nope.
Or that it was only said in private or something like that when no one else was listening. But trust me, I was way back when CBC had farm reporters. They were all men, of course. And 1976, this was in Toronto, I became CBC's first, and as it turned out, because they got rid of them after, 9 years later, I was the first woman farm reporter. And so Alderdahl, that would have been like a tame thing to be called. Yeah, we didn't talk about that on air though, did we? Next, of course, we have Tony Doucette, and you haven't been retired very long, have you? 4 years. Wow, 4 years. There are people in here who weren't even born when Percy and I retired, so go on, Tony.
Thank you, Barbara. Begin by pointing out that in December of 1975, I was in grade 12 at Orlando High School. Percy and I are both children of military men, and that's why we both lived in Oromocto, New Brunswick, which is adjacent to Canadian Forces Base Gagetown. I arrived here to be a radio sportscaster in March of 1989. which is, gosh, almost 37 years ago, which I find truly remarkable. And that was just a few months before they took CBC television news off the air here. And when it went back on the air in 1994, I was a radio sportscaster for the first 5 years I was here. And in 1994, I was talked into, encouraged, not pleaded with, but as it turned out, it was a good move, to become a television sportscaster, which quite frankly scared the pants off me initially. TV and radio are very, very different mediums.
Don't worry, Tony, it's not your time.
Thank you. And after 12 years of television sports, they gave me the job of hosting Windsor Morning on CBC Radio. And at that time, we had the luxury of a municipal affairs reporter, Gino Conte, who covered municipal affairs. That was his beat. So let me give you kind of a scenario as to how things worked then and how things work now, or at least did up to the point that I retired, and still somewhat similar. Chris can correct me if I'm mistaken. When Gino was our municipal affairs reporter, we knew going into council meetings on Monday what he deemed the big stories to be. He had a really close relationship with city councillors, with senior members of administration. He had the confidence of those people, so whenever anything was happening that was supposed to be somewhat on the hush-hush or off the record, guaranteed that at least half the time Gino knew what was going on. And because he was trusted, a lot of members of council confided in him. And all we had to do was sit back and live with what Gino brought back into the office. And of course that was shared with television. Percy, toward the end of his career with us, was a dedicated municipal affairs reporter as well. So he knows how all of that works. You're around these people all the time. They know you, they trust you, you become friends with them, until such point as you do something not so friendly, which journalism requires from time to time. The way things worked later on, when I became, later on in my tenure as host of Windsor Morning, was that we no longer had municipal affairs reporters. The staff was cut to the point where people had to be pretty darn nimble and multi-skilled. People like Chris, I'll give him credit for it, because if he goes to a city council meeting now, he's responsible for doing a television story, doing a radio story, and providing written material for the web. It's an amazing demand on modern CBC reporters locally. Those who work for the network still have luxuries that local reporters do not. So in any event, let me give you a typical Friday to explain the way things worked when I retired. And let's set this on a Friday morning. My alarm goes off at 3:45 in the morning, which it did for 16 goddamn years, which is one of the reasons why I'm thoroughly enjoying retirement. Get to the office by about 4:30 and start pouring through the information left me at closing time the day before, which prepares me to host the morning show that day. Research done by colleagues of mine, some of it by me, but usually on a Thursday or Friday, because we have no dedicated municipal affairs reporter, we would look at the city council agenda, which is available to everybody online at citywindsor.ca, I'm happy to report. And we would comb through that agenda and ask ourselves, what in that agenda are people going to be talking about? Which really was the question that drove us on a day-to-day basis, regardless of the subject matter. But we would apply that to city council and determine, well, what's it going to be? To give you an example, maybe it's funding for the streetcar down on the river, which to some Windsorites is and was very controversial, but in any event, we would choose that to be the story we were going to cover from City Council that week. So we would be doing this late in the week, on Thursday or Friday, so what we try to do is hit the ground running on Monday. Can we line up an interview with someone with regard to that story before the council meeting that Monday night? So what we try to do is find someone who might have a strong opinion one way or the other, be it an opponent, be it someone who's completely behind the project, to try to give that night's meeting some context before the meeting actually began. And then one of our reporters would head off to the meeting that evening. And that, by the way, the audio from that morning interview would be shared throughout the day on CBC News, radio news. And as the years went on, they installed cameras in the radio studio. So now a lot of the video that comes from those radio studio interviews is shared with television as well. So reporter would go to the council meeting, would record everything that's gone on in the council meeting, and leave about 2 hours of audio in a computer that we all had access to. I would arrive back at the studio on Tuesday morning at 4:30, and based on the recommendation of the reporter who worked and covered that meeting, try to find a titillating piece of audio, be it 2 or 3 minutes, that we could play for our audience the following morning that would move the story a little bit forward. And that's essentially the way it was covered then, and unless I'm mistaken, and I listen to Windsor Morning every day, and it seemed to me that that's the way it's covered now. It was always, the underlying purpose of all of it was always to try to explain to listeners what was going on with their city council. Not to take a stand one way or the other, but to try to be as balanced as we could and to explain to our listeners what was going on with their municipal government. Some people say that, well, you have to be absolutely fair and absolutely unbiased, which is a wonderful idea, but it doesn't happen. And there's a very good reason why it doesn't happen. It's because we all bring our biases and our points of view to the stories that we do, even in the decisions to, deciding which stories we do. What we try to do for the most part is surround ourselves with enough ideas and enough points of view that we could arrive at the fairest approach possible. There's no perfect, unbiased reporting. It just does not happen. But we tried as hard as was humanly possible to be as fair as we could and to be able to defend the reporting that we might have done on any particular story. Not sure where else to take this conversation aside from sort of bemoaning the fact that the media in Windsor is certainly not what it used to be. We've all looked at copies of the Windsor Star lately. We all know about the human resource challenges with the CBC, and particularly in private broadcasting. Everybody is doing more with less. And just before I retired, around the office one day, we took a little head count. We figured it out, that there are more public relations / media relations professionals working in this city, vastly more than there are journalists. Therefore, it's a bit of a challenge. Because in some cases, if there's a story within the city government they wanted to get to, you maybe could call the head of the city's head traffic engineer, who might have some things to tell you, but not without approval from communications. And if it was somewhat controversial, then I'm certain approval from the mayor. So there are hoops we had to jump through, people we had to work around. And we would occasionally reach out to a city councillor who would basically say, well, the hell with communications. Yeah, I'll talk to you, because he or she may have felt strongly enough about a particular issue that they weren't willing to leave that decision up to a communications and public relations individual. So that's basically all I have.
I think Chris is going to come up here and tell us about a vastly different world. Because I watch and listen and read now with CBC, and I'm like, I don't know how one person did all that, or how they got this, or how they... Anyway, it's just puzzling and amazing. So Chris, come on up and tell us how you do it.
I think the first rule of thumb is you never follow a Newfoundlander and somebody who hosts the radio to tell stories after them. I think that was the big one here. I don't know if this is on. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so my name's Chris. I've been doing this for about 15 years with CBC exclusively. I would have to say the concept of the public broadcaster was really drilled into me, a kid who grew up in London, Ontario, and watched A channel CTV all his life. When I went out east to tell stories, I was working out of Labrador for a while. To give a sense of the technology change, I was 2 reporters behind, so 2 before me, used to film their stand-ups, edit it together, put the tape on a plane. The plane would fly to St. John's, someone would pick it up, they'd put it in the VCR, they'd play it out the next day. Now we do most of it with our iPhone. I think Mr. Hanna's recording it out there, sort of giving you a sense of that shift that we've seen. Telling stories today is enjoyable, it's fun. I think I still work for the corporation, so I'll be a little different in how I talk about it. But I think when you hear about the amount of people who are telling stories in Windsor, we talk about the people who are trained professionals. You go to journalism school, you come out of it, and then you think about the people who have the ability to go to meetings and share stories the way that they want to. Or you think of the councillors who have the ability to influence decisions that are being made as well. As a person who works with a public broadcaster on taxpayers' dimes, the thought process that I have when I decide what stories are important are the ones that people aren't talking about. We've got to be there for the conversation. When people are talking about the ice rink, we've got to talk about the ice rink. When people are talking about what's going on with Donald Trump these days, we've got to be there, and we have to provide the Canadian perspective, the Windsor perspective, of how those decisions affect us. But then we also think about some of the stories that maybe people don't want to talk about. And when you think about the ice rink opening up, one of the conversations we had about were the benches. And it seems so simple and small, but one of the stories that we found was that Windsor was going to move forward in and around the time tariffs were coming down with the purchase of benches manufactured by companies in the United States. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Didn't something that made a huge financial commitment, but it was contrary to what they were saying inside of the council meetings of we want to protect Canadian jobs, we want to do what we can for people in Windsor. And so our job was just to bring that to light and show people what was going on. And that required a lot of research, it required a lot of time. I missed stories to get that story that other organizations were able to cover. But because we're the public broadcaster, we're afforded the time to find the stories people aren't talking about that people will then talk about. So we covered the story, changed policy, and council said that they were going to adjust how they went forward with bidding to make sure that they were able to source materials that were locally made. I don't know if that's the right decision or the wrong decision, but we brought it forward, we brought it to light so that the public had a concept of what was happening as these conversations were going. And I think about that a lot as we try and decide what to do and how to show stories to people in Windsor that people are talking about. And we talk about the team and the technology and what's available to us now. I think about Sandpoint Beach a lot. The beach is one that is now closed because people keep dying at the beach. There have been reports that have been brought forward to have conversations about whether the beach should be shifted or changed, and council has made agreements that they say they're going to back certain master plans and that they're going to fund projects, and we follow it bit by bit and drip by drip. Something tragic happens and it leads to the closure of the beach, and we're still trying to fully understand how dangerous that beach is to present to people why changes need to be made. Jacob Barker over there now has access to technology called a drone. And so I say, hey Jacob, let's pull this thing out, let's throw it in the air. And so, not available back in the day, but I'm sure he'd love to have it now. He flies a drone up in the air at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, we create this plan. He throws it up there on a beautiful sunny day, and we can see the way the water shifts into itself and folds over and how dangerous those currents are from above. We take that video, we talk to people around, and we ask what could be changed or what could be done, and they say follow the master plan that's already approved. But we also send it over to our graphics team out in Winnipeg. And so some person that we work with, usually a guy named Duck, don't even know his last name, But he's great. He takes that video, he shows on the currents there the way the water hits the berm that comes out and what creates such a tragic set of circumstances that can lead to somebody dying in the water. We piece that together, we show it at night, people look at it and they say, wow, we've never seen it from that angle before. That's why we're here, I think. Especially when we talk about the amount of work that we have to do now because of staffing and the resources that have disappeared. There's new stuff too that helps. And I think of the moments you're able to lean on your teammates like Barker and that, to be able to have the perspective that changes the conversation a little bit. And it'll be brought up again and again as council tries to make a decision on what to do next there. And so I think about that from the technology perspective. And when I think about the importance of having a Canadian broadcaster here, not to discredit CTV or Windsor Star, they do great work, but the mandate's different. It's not City Hall related, but it's adjacent and somebody will, I don't know, it'll be interesting. The blockade. When the blockade happened and people said, we're not going to let anything go across the Ambassador Bridge until mandates are changed, until Doug Ford makes a decision, until Trudeau takes a decision. I was out there, I was afforded a camera person for this one. So it was a luxury assignment to stand there for 12 hours getting yelled at. But we had people with us. And I remember the first day, it was about, oh, there's no access, where is the access point? But we all know that there's 2 access points to the Ambassador Bridge. And so once we were able to pull away from our network responsibilities and talking about how it's limited access, we moved over towards the one area that you could go through, and we showed Canadians and people in Windsor, hey, there's an access point, this is how you can move forward if you want to go across. We showed people what was happening on the ground. The moment that happened, the protesters pivoted over and they closed up that section as well, which to me was just a sign that the people who often call for the defunding of the CBC are also using the CBC. And it shifted the way the story was told, because now it led to, I was told, an escalation within the Prime Minister's office because the full closure of the Ambassador Bridge was something that was just an economic nightmare. And I just think about those moments where your job becomes something that is of value to Canadians, where you're telling the story from perspective that on the ground they might not get. And I just think that that's something that we hold close to us as a public broadcaster, especially in these moments where we have a lot of conversations about fact and fiction, what's true, what's false, and what is our job? Is it to call out the lies? Is it to say something is right or wrong? Or is it just to present what is occurring and allow things to happen because of that? And with those 3 moments, I really think of the job as something where I'm going to shed a light on something that people may not want to talk about or they aren't talking about already. And people can do what they want with that information. Which brings us back again a bit to the idea of access to officials. I work at City Hall now, and it's my primary beat, but sometimes we go and do something else as well. What will happen is the City Hall report will come out 10 days before council meets. I read that top to bottom, 300, 400 pages, whatever it is. And if I have any questions about that report, I'll want to go to a non-biased source to try and figure it out. So we try and contact the City of Windsor to get somebody from the administration to speak about that report. Something has recently changed where staff will not be allowed to talk about that report when we make that request until the decision is made, which means that I can't get the person who's putting together the report for councillors to explain or answer questions that I, a reporter, might have about this, which makes me think about how the public might get those questions answered from the staff as well. I can go to a councillor and I can get their concept about what it means, but we're losing access to officials in the way that we used to have. And it affects the ability of the public to have input on decisions. And then you go to a council meeting and you cover it, and we're often told that that's the moment where people have the opportunity to speak their voice and have impact on the decision one way or another. But we have also heard from elected officials that that is largely theater, and the best time to have a conversation about those decisions is beforehand. And so I just wonder what that leaves us with if we're not paying attention to what's happening when the agenda is presented and the decisions are made on reports we can't get questions answered to, that then fall in the hand of politicians who say this decision is largely made before the meeting happens. It's just a question, but I ask it and I just put it out there for people in the public to make their decisions when they move forward. That's a big change that I've noticed in covering everything. And that's, I guess, the time.
No, finish what you're
That's
saying.
it. It's just something that matters. And I know that people have so much in their day that to read the 300-page report, 400-page report, think about how it affects them, go to council, make a presentation, bump into the politician at Costco. That's not a guarantee, and it's not an easy thing to rely on. But I do appreciate the position that we're in as a public broadcaster to be the people asking questions on the public's behalf, try and get those answers and present that in whatever way it's presented to us back to the community. So I appreciate the trust people put in us to tell the stories properly, and I appreciate the time people take to read those stories, and I appreciate the way Windsor has valued the CBC and its community, and I hope that we meet the mandate that you've given us as we move forward. So I wanted to say that and let people know what it's like to do the job these days. But that's it. That's all I got.
We often see or hear they wouldn't make a comment, or but I do have to say there was one time I remember, and I don't know if Tony and Percy would agree with me or remember it the same way, but because we had access to government scientists and ministers and things like that. And you remember when Stephen Harper was first elected, and all of a sudden it's like, we're not allowed to do an interview. Like a federal scientist who was, heading up some huge report that was coming up, they couldn't do an interview with us. So we were glad when that disappeared. The other thing that you mentioned about the drone, back in the day, you'd have to hire a helicopter. And there was never a time when the CBC budget, they had hired helicopters for a few things back in the day, but I don't think a helicopter would have been hired for that. Now, who has a question for anybody up here? Hands up.
No comment.
I have a question about that. Go, Dale. Dale just retired from CBC, last summer?
Yeah, there's never been a better time to be retired from journalism. That's my point. Obvious technological stuff that you guys brought up, and I just want to, it's probably directed to Chris. How do you cover the Twilight Zone? This is just the Twilight Zone. It's just too much bullshit and just absolute craziness. And that's why I'm glad I'm not doing it anymore, because I think somebody would get punched if I was actually, covering the president right now.
I think it's just, the Gordie Howe is so fascinating. We had conversations about whether is it worth covering? Is it something that we should give airspace to? If the United States has elected a leader that is able to decide in a true social post whether or not a bridge that Canada spent billions on lives or dies, and in the newsroom you're having conversations about, is this something that we're giving air to that perpetuates something that may not be true in the end? Those are the types of conversations we're having, which usually end in us covering the story. For me, in that moment, I was telling that story for a national audience because the national was like, hey, Chris, go figure this one out. And so the first thing I said, I looked at everybody, I said, okay, I got to go to Sandwichtown. And my job in that moment was to ask people who've been sandwiched between the Ambassador Bridge and the Gordie Howe what they think about this moment. And They were not impressed. There were words I couldn't repeat on air. But they had educated thoughts about what was occurring, and my job was to bring that to the rest of Canada. And so I remember the discussions then inside of a producer meeting at the national level where the conversation was, is this a conversation about NAFTA? Are these bigger negotiations that are ongoing here? How much does this really matter? Is he going to do it? And my job in that moment was to bring the voices of Windsorites who say, we are frustrated by the tariffs, but this seems to have put people over the edge. That's what they were telling me. I told them, and we wind up there at 9 o'clock with Adrian Arsenault, bringing that mood to the rest of Canada. I think that's valuable. I think that's what the beauty of the CBC is. If it's Trump talking about a bridge here and just letting people say what they need to say, or the fishery out east, letting other parts of Canada understand how folks at home feel is, I think, something that's needed to tie it all together. But that's how those conversations are very much, do you cover a story from somebody who spouts a lot of stuff out? And on that day we said, yeah. What would you guys do? How do you guys?
Well, I would go back to something I mentioned a moment ago. We would have we called it what it was. It was a story meeting. We'd get together as a group of radio and television journalists every morning and talk about the stories of the day. And again, it was, what is everybody talking about today? I mean, the question wasn't that overt, but that was a general idea that sort of kick-started the decision-making process. And everybody on that day, I guarantee you, was talking about that. We could not, how do you ignore that story, particularly here?
The beauty about the CBC is call it the file footage, if you will, that you have documented proof in your media library about what led to, after 9/11, what led to the construction or the decision to build another crossing. You have all the other locations that were considered, even the bottom of Lausanne Parkway that Maroon owns, or Lausanne Road rather. But then we come to a decision, this is where it's going to be built. Americans didn't have any money. We say we're going to build it, and we'll get the money back from the fees, and then Michigan, and we'll share the money. So you get all that documented proof. You get all the previous prime ministers and governors, and even Mr. Trump in his first term was saying, "Yeah, what a great idea. Go ahead, blah blah." And then you turn to what happens. So you can do a story on what's happening. Then you do the background piece to it. And then the public can put two and two together and say, holy shit, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Well, no, it doesn't. And here's the proof. But I mean, that's one of the beauties of the CBC is when you do a story, it's documented, it's there, go pluck it out of the library and put it on the air, remind people how we got here. Veronica Nicolika has a question. I see your hand up in the back. Can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Veronica.
Yeah, okay. I used to work at CBC, so I should be able to project. Maybe I forgot. So I'm with Barbara and Tony and Chrissy and Logan and Dale. And what I'm wondering, and it's so easy to say because I'm not in your shoes, I'm not in your business. Is there a way to fight back this nonsense at City Hall? What do you mean you can't talk to a councillor until a particular event happens? Like, we're paying their salary, including the mayor, like I said. Easy for me to say, I don't know our branch, but is there a way to raise some hell?
Well, there's a very subtle way.
It just, right before we do, councillors in general have been, or you want something like, councillors in general respond. It's the city administration who wrote the report that are difficult to get a hold of.
I'm sorry.
It's city staff are the ones who we often have a tough time talking to. Councillors are generally available to talk about what's going on. It's the unbiased report from the city administration that we have difficult getting.
What he said. But there's a very subtle way to draw attention to situations like that. And you'll hear it from time to time, not just with the CBC, but in many other media, print, radio, or television, was that at the end of the report, a member of council was not made available to us to comment on this. Or we asked these questions of the city and we received a prepared statement, or we didn't hear from them at all.
Or you got an email.
Well, that happens a lot. Chris knows all about that. But, I mean, but as far as fighting it to get them to change the policy, as I said before, there are so many public relations and media relations people in the city. What are you going to do? I mean, even nonprofits have them now. It's incredible.
And don't forget, it's not just municipal politics. Our 2 federal members wouldn't come to any candidates' debates, wouldn't allow themselves to be interviewed, and they still get elected, right? And the same with the guy in the counties, the 3 of them. So that's been prevailing, the lack of allowing the public to hear from you before the election, and they still get elected. So there's something going on within the public as well that, you know, they'll do what they have to do, but the visibility of your candidate isn't, you know, sometimes you're electing people that don't live in your riding, never done anything for your riding, but you like their party or their politics or whatever's going on. So, David.
I understand there was a few civil suits flying around, like Tom Hunt being fired and the former CEO and so on and so on. We could go back a long time, as you all know. But I'm wondering if there's been any updates on them. Some are probably settled and some aren't, but we haven't heard much lately. And I think that's an important input that the courts can play in the public knowing about that. The other question was, I understand that Mr. Trudeau, when he was Prime Minister, had plans to enhance the CBC by making them more independent from political pressure and better financed. And I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of Mr. Carney proceeding with that. And also just to mention the importance of CBC.
Well, there's 2 good ones. I mean, let him answer first.
I'll just say on the Mr. Nepsey was a former engineer who filed a wrongful dismissal lawsuit. That was settled. The city won't say how much money that was settled for, but that allowed peek into whichever side you believe what it's like to work at City Hall. Tom Hunt's were following through. I reached out to his lawyers as recently as December. I look at the court case every day and I see nothing moving in that regard. The city's not defended itself against his statement. Tom Hunt was the lead planner at the city who has filed a wrongful dismissal lawsuit, I believe it was 2 years ago now. As for, I've never been pressed. No one's ever given me a sheet and said, say this. No one's ever said, go do this politically. Carney, the government we have now, I know that I'm not too well educated in this, and I apologize, but I know that we are seeing positions added in smaller communities across Canada that were not available before, which excites me. I've pitched to put us out in Chatham, Kent, and Sarnia. I think those are news deserts that the public broadcasters should be in. And I'm excited to learn more about it every day.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask you that as well, because often on Facebook or any kind of social media, the people who want to defund the CBC are like, well, the Prime Minister's just telling me what to say.
Yeah.
And every time I read that, I think, okay, I haven't been there for a while, but I know when we were there, like, you would, if that happened, that would be the story.
Yeah.
You'd be all over that, so it doesn't happen. I just want to say a note before we close things up here, and the magic show comes on. These guys are not magic. A number of people worked on doing that exhibition. Phil Peck is back here. Lynn Rayburn is here somewhere. There he is. Sandy's here. Joanne. Laura Prey is here. My old buddy Dan Kennedy. He and I worked together for like 83 million years.
Why don't all the former CBC employees just stand up
and some of the audience. So thanks to the people who put the exhibition together, celebrating the first 75 years of the CBC radio. radio in Windsor, the 50 years of CBC television, and 55 of CBF as well. And I have to say that back when I worked, like we all wrote scripts. So sometimes it would be a script I wrote, sometimes it would be a script someone else wrote. Phil Peck actually wrote this for me. When he sent this to me the other day, I'm like, oh, okay. I was going to do that, but that's good. I didn't have to do anything. All I had to do was stand up here and read it. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Thank you, guys. That was really fun. And we'll carry on the party over at the exhibition hall where all our display is.
Thanks, Barb.